Dr. Freya.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mayuk. And I want to thank everybody who has organized the critical summer school that we're enjoying. It's such a great program. And what a creative idea of engaging us in thinking collaboratively with people from all over the world to come together and think about these really important issues in the time of the crisis of COVID. And I'm really honored to be following Dr. Raymond and his talk. I've enjoyed collaborations with him. And I think his talk has been really helpful in thinking through justice issues in tourism. So I'm going to follow on from him with some thinking that I've been doing recently and sharing with you some of these ideas. I would like to do something that we do in Australia, which is to acknowledge the Aboriginal custodians of country in recognizing that this is a settler colonial place and that the Aboriginal people never ceded sovereignty to their country. So the custodians of the place on which I'm speaking to you from are the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. And they have cared for this country and they continue to care for this country. And I acknowledge that role that they've played. And that is a justice issue here in Australia. It's also important when we talk about justice issues in tourism for us to be transparent in our positionality. So for me, I just like to make it clear that I'm a critical scholar of tourism. And in my way of thinking about critical scholarship, what I think is that involves dealing with matters of oppression, justice, and emancipation. So as I go through my talk, you might see how that critical scholarship informs what I want to share with you at the moment. So we've heard many speakers start with this 17 Sustainable Development Goals and giving you information about it. This presentation goes with the wheel, and the wheel may be informative in this talk of understanding that these goals are interrelated, and then they go to complexity with 169 targets sitting behind them. The UN World Tourism Organization is the global body representing tourism interest, chose 8, 12, and 14. So dealing with work, dealing with economic growth, dealing with the marine environment, and then also dealing with sustainable production and consumption. And I think that Dr. Raymond's presentation raised the question if climate change had been a focus. In these times when we're facing one of the greatest crises of our times with climate change, we might ask, what would be our focus if we had chosen for the tourism industry and tourism stakeholders different goals to focus upon rather than just these three? Could we have chosen more? Could we have chosen different ones? So for instance, if goal 10 had been chosen about reduced inequalities, it would have brought to the forefront perhaps initiatives on social tourism. And that would be about perhaps stepping back from the market and the profit side of the tourism industry and looking at ensuring that everybody benefits from tourism. Or alternatively, we could have chosen goal 5 and looked at gender issues and inclusivity of women, women's rights and women's needs through tourism. So that's something that you might keep in mind is, why were these goals chosen and what would have happened if we had chosen different ones? And I'd like to just be critical that the responsible consumption in the marine environments probably goes because of the niches that are profitable around marine tourism and around responsible tourism. And of course, growth underpins the UN World Tourism Organization's views of the industry. So a critical lens will ask us to think about the whys and what could have been if things had been different. So in doing this talk, I'd like to just bring these critical comments that were made as a source of critical insights. I think some of the people that have spoken to you previously have said the UN Sustainable Development Goals follow upon the Millennium Development Goals. And obviously the Millennium Development Goals were not sufficient to achieve the outcomes. And that's why we've moved into the 2030 agenda for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So McCloskey said we need a critical consciousness about the failure of the MDGs, and that particularly comes to a failure to get to the root sources of the problem of poverty. So we need to understand that these goals are about dealing with poverty and how development might solve poverty issues in communities around the world. The other thing about these Sustainable Development Goals is they're inclusive of all nations rather than just being focused on the developing world. Michael Hall, who spoke to you earlier in the week as an expert lecturer, talked about the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, and he said that it's particularly pursued from a managerial approach, and it emphasizes growth and business approaches, and that obscures what are actually also in the Sustainable Development Goals agendas of social and environmental concerns. And then lastly, I just quote the gem Sir David Attenborough, who spoke before the UN Security Council recently. And he said to that important body, which is dealing with peace and security issues in the global community, that the biggest threat that we face to humanity is climate change, and to concentrate our minds on that. So these are some important articulations to say we need to keep our critical thinking active and not be idealistic about the goals. So what I'll propose to you is I'd like to draw upon my research on peace through tourism, and particularly there's a longstanding peace analyst named Stuart Rees who talked about understanding peace within the context of justice, which he defined as not only the absence of conflict, but also the presence of fairness, justice, and equity in society, and economy and politics. So really what this asks us to do is to go to the wider structural context of where tourism occurs and to ask, are we achieving progress toward fairness, justice, and equity rather than just reducing conflict? And particularly with the peace and justice in Sustainable Development Goal 16, it emphasizes the idea of governance, but governance isn't getting to these underlying structures of fairness, justice, and equity. That's a more deep level. So with tourism, we might interrogate it. And I like that word that comes from critical tourism studies: interrogate, question, challenge. What is tourism's role in conflict, in poverty, in exploitation, and all forms of supremacy? And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. And I'm going to offer a provocation that I think where we stand in the situation between the global North and the global South, and the failure to alleviate poverty and the failure to address development, is because we failed to decolonize, and that there's ongoing injustices between these relationships. And I think that imperialistic forces are still operative. And I'll try to explain that in the brief time that I have. So the framing that I want to offer is to put tourism in the context of an unjust international system and go through some history, which suggests it could have been otherwise, that we missed a moment in the 1970s. And I think that because our communities, our knowledge systems are becoming ahistorical, that we've forgotten this moment in history that was missed. There was a movement for decolonization in the 1960s and 70s, and developing countries called for a transition to a new international economic order, the NIEO. The NIEO was meant to push decolonization, independency on imperial powers, and bring about a new economic system that would be based upon interdependency and fair economies. There was resistance in the Third World, or the Global South, through the group of 77 nations to resist Western dominance. And this was subject to the time of the Cold War. I note that we had international agreements which were supposed to be a body of rights that ensured that humans could thrive. But the convention that got more grip in the international system was the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, rather than the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So the first was implemented and the latter has been left to states to address. But these are rights that people have to food, housing, proper living conditions, dignity, and decent life. And those are not enforceable, whereas the Covenant for Civil and Political Rights has been more willing to be enforced. And then another pillar of this was the idea that the global North owed the global South because of imperialism and the taking of resources, pillaging of developing countries through imperial colonization, that the North owed the South aid, technology, and a fair trading system, and that there would be a target of 0.7% of gross national income owed by countries to support global South countries to reach a fair economy, a global economy. That was a UN target from 1970. Very few countries ever reached it. And I note that the UK legislated it in 2017. It is rare that countries did implement it. Some of the Scandinavian countries did. So what I then want to just do is to move to tourism, to say that we had this possibility that then has been overshadowed. But this situation in the global community in the 1970s actually was mirrored in tourism. So for instance, Donna Chambers worked with, I think, David Airy in this work about Jamaica and talking about the tourism policy. And Jamaica at decolonization, 1972 to 1980, had a socialist era. And it was the Jamaicanization of the tourism industry that was about a domestic sector, empowerment of workers, indigenous values, and ensuring that the Jamaican society benefited from a form of tourism that enhanced their dignity and their values as a people. There's also a great piece of work on Ghana about the same time under President Rowley, written by Ingman, that also analyzes the situation in Ghana, talking about decolonization and the connection to African diasporic communities as a source of pride. So you can see this history that sat there, and then you can ask what we've transitioned to in this moment and what we might have missed as a result of that. I think this history matters. Instead, what we got from then this moment of justice that could have come from decolonization, instead we got neoliberal globalization, which particularly came because the Cold War collapsed and we didn't have that rivalry. We got structural adjustment programs on developing countries enforced by the World Bank and the IMF. The terms of trade were imposed by the World Trade Organization. So for instance, in tourism, we had the General Agreement on Trades and Services, which has created unfair conditions of trade for developing countries in the tourism sector and have pushed countries to reduce their social and environmental protections. So this is a really important context to understand. And in terms of tourism, what happened is tourism was promoted as a path to development by the United Nations and the World Tourism Organization and other bodies. And as a result, we've gotten real vulnerabilities for developing countries over tourism dependency because their subsistence sectors have been reduced and they've been told tourism is an easy path to development. Now, if you want to do some reading about this to understand what I'm talking about, because I've done a very quick run through some complicated history, the work by Moforth and Munt on tourism sustainability in 2016 is a great support for this discussion. So have a look at that. So some of the markers of tourism injustices that arise from this situation is we get privatization of land, privatization of the right to land. So for instance, with the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, the beaches were privatized in the aftermath of that crisis, of that disaster. You have the taking of the commons and dispossession of people. That is already happening here in Australia, for instance, that our national parks are being allowed to have private eco-lodges developed against the will of the community. Tourism dependency, I've already mentioned, and the loss of subsistence. We see this in places like Kenya, where they're growing flowers for the markets of Europe, and places like Bali that are very exposed to a tourism dependency. We get tourism imposition on places and loss of self-determination. I'd suggest that's what we see in Barcelona when cheap package tours bring over tourism to Barcelona. You get the dominance of big multinationals, which I'm really worried is only going to get worse after COVID. So for instance, the dominance of TUI out of Europe is going to be huge in the global community. And with that, you get the difficulties for the informal sectors in the global South to thrive. You get exploitative work conditions in tourism and hospitality. So we find poor pay, poor working conditions, seasonality, precarity. And even here in Australia, we've got wage theft, widespread wage theft in these sectors. There's mobility inequalities. So we find refugees can't find safe haven when they need it, but tourists have free access. We have a business failure to pay taxes by the big end of town in corporations. In the cruise sector, they use flags of convenience to avoid paying the taxes that they owe and to reduce their taxes through those mechanisms. And then finally, we get these ecological damages and violence. And I think that the work of, Rob Fletcher and Bram Butcher is really good about this, about the creation of national parks in parts of Africa like Tanzania and Kenya, taking away the land from indigenous peoples, and in fact, militarizing the place and the safety of the conservation. So those are some examples. And then what I want to introduce to you is this idea of supremacy, that I think one of the problems that we see sitting behind these injustices is ideas of supremacy. And I think Raymond alluded to some of these things happening. And I call this a circle of domination. So we've got racism and white supremacy, which is what drove the imperial colonial conquest of the European powers in the developing world. We've got patriarchy of men's dominance of women. We've got anthropocentrism of domination of nature and animals. We have ideas of religious supremacy, that some religions are better than others and justify violence and injustices. And then, of course, I've been talking about imperialism and colonization. If we take the thinking of Kimberly Crenshaw, who talked about intersectionality of oppressions, these things are interlinked together and reinforcing. So it's important to understand that. And then my question is tourism a form of supremacy? Does tourism ideology assert this oppression as well? So the fact that the tourist interest and tourism industry interest override local communities is a real concern of mine. So I'll propose that that might be a form of supremacy as well. So then I just want to bring Hawaii as an example into this and to show the problems that can exist and how Hawaii has become a place for tourism that has erased the local people and their local sovereignty. I don't think many people are aware that Hawaii is an occupied land. The local monarchy that the Kanaka Maoli, which are the native Hawaiian people, had, was illegally overthrown. And it was overthrown by American planters. And the Hawaiians have never ceded sovereignty to their land. So this is still an ongoing place that needs decolonization and removal from imperialism. And the results of this situation, you've had the illegal occupation, then leading to it becoming a military base, a major place for US military, then an imposed form of tourism that's very offensive to culture and that takes up Hawaiian sacred practices and beliefs and commercializes and commodifies it. And then lastly, this removal of the native people because they can't afford the land anymore. So a real oppression of the peoples in this situation. So this slide mentions some of the things that come out of this. Haunani Kane Trask, who recently passed away, has opposed this and drawn attention to what happened to Hawaii for a number of years. And she says tourists flock to this native place as a land for escape, and they don't understand that they're participating in the destruction of a people. And she said in another quote, "We ask you not to come." The churches in Hawaii promulgated the 1989 Hawaii Declaration on Tourism, which said tourism is not an indigenous practice. And they see tourism as an exploitation, and that tourism actually damages sacred sites, the beaches, it threatens the culture, and it's very bad. And then more recently, the native Hawaiian, the Kanaka Maoli people have been opposing what's being done to animals. So there was a real controversy that some mainland American Instagrammers took a picture of petting a monk seal resting on the beach, which really angered the Hawaiian people because monk seals are endangered. and they're very important to Hawaiian beliefs of protection that they have. And the dolphins as well. This thing from the Facebook page of Protect Mauna Kea talks about the dolphins being harassed by the tourists. So again, is that blue economy? Are we seeing that fit under the Sustainable Development Goals, this dolphin tourism that exploits the dolphins? There are reactions to this, though, and one exciting thing that's happened is something called Detours, and this stands for decolonial tourism. And many actors in Hawaii are trying to decolonize tourism and assert Native authority over the place. So it is a challenge to the neo-colonial authority. Detours mark the envisioning of another Hawaii and bringing that to life before the people on the tour's eyes. The decolonial effort of Detours is to restore the Ea of Hawaii. Ea refers to both political independence, but is also translated as the meaning of life and breath, so it's essential. So what this is evoking is experience of Hawaii is about the land, the relationships formed through the process of remembering, and that these are storied places, and that we need to understand the stories that pertain to this place. So this brings us to the idea that Detours offer an alternative travel guide, and that we need to understand that there are protocols for visiting a place, and that we should request permission before entering. If we do this, this changes tourism. This gives local communities the rights to be real custodians of place. The permission to enter a well-loved place is conditional, though. It demands that we have encounters, and that the deference to the authority of the local knowledge is essential. And also to understand that you may not be granted to a place, that the opportunity to enter a particular location may be reserved for only some. And so that tells tourists that you can't have everything that you want. It changes the power equation. So that brings me to my recent work, which is looking at redefining tourism by the local community. This is a process of local communities inviting, receiving, and hosting guests in their local community for limited time durations, with the intention that they receive benefits from such actions. Now, this shifts the power equation so that it's not the tourist and the tourism industry that are demanding things and making local communities into host communities. It is centered upon the local community's rights being the basis of all interactions. And then it changes the relationships with all stakeholders as a result of that. And so this model shows you this. So tourists need to be guests. Tourism businesses need to understand that they must have a social license to operate. And industry associations are not marketing bodies, that there are bodies to serve the community's interest and the public good. So by this model, if it can be done, we could transform tourism to a more just basis, in my view. And then continuing on with that, what we mean by local community in this work, we're working at defining this, that local community is the local people, but it's the local ecology as well, and it's all the generations. So that gets back to what Dr. Raymond was saying to you about a more than human approach, that we are humans in relationship with our place. And we're not only the humans of today, we're the humans of the past, and we're the humans of the future. Now, I'm running out of time, so I will get very close to finishing now. Defining the tourism by the local community must enact the following: ensure that local communities benefit from tourism in their localities, allow communities key roles in decision-making, but ultimately the big one is allow the community to say no. We know that communities are empowered if they can say no to tourism. And we're finding this in places like Barcelona, in Venice recently is saying no to the big cruise ships. And then could we localize tourism like the Jamaicanization program that I referred to earlier that was done between 1972 and 1980, as Professor Chambers talked about, where the tourism benefits the workers and the local communities. And you think about local community benefiting as tourists. So how far does this go in addressing the issues of tourism? This is what I'm challenging you to think about. So does this solve things? Is it possible that we could address things like global development issues and climate change by such approach? What lens do we use to look at the Sustainable Development Goals? Are we looking at no poverty and zero hunger in our efforts? Which goals are prioritized? These are all critical questions I'd like you to think about as you walk away from this summer school, and to do some deep thinking about that. So what about COVID-19? Are things going to be different? Well, in Bali, it was reported in a great article in the New York Times, if I remember correctly, that the villages in the north were finding that the workers from the south, where a lot of the tourism development is, were going back to their family villages and going back to the land as a result of COVID-19. And one local leader was quoted as saying, people are depending on tourism like it's opium. Tourism is fragile and we've gone too far. We've abandoned the fundamental things that mobilize the economy. So this idea of dependency, I think, is a big justice issue. And in fact, a report on the situation with COVID not very long ago, released by the UN Committee on Development and the UN World Tourism Organization, actually flagged that tourism dependency may be a problem. So my whole talk is to get us to think about that, about how do we put tourism in its proper place, in its structural context, and how do we make it serve communities? Then I think we're getting to an agenda where justice might be served. So I've given in my PowerPoint, which will be in the recording if you want to follow through, some links for some case studies that could help you explore these ideas. There are no easy answers and it's very complicated. And then lastly, my references. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'm really privileged to be such a part of this great event, and I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you.